Hi, this is Joe, the Healing Tree, and we offer natural health products for everyday living. And our website is healingtreeproducts.com. And today we have a special guest, and the topic for today's discussion is self-mastery and communication, how to have a healthy relationship with yourself and the people around you. Our guest today, his name is Jason Keene, and he collaborates with conscious couples and individuals and shows them how to create greater connection, synergy, and impact their relationships by grounding their spiritual growth in the principles of conscious relating. Now, Jason brings 20 years of developing teams and leaders in professional environments such as Blockbuster Video, Whole Foods Market, and MINDBODY Software, combined with over a decade of powerful one-on-one in the fields of alchemical hypnotherapy, clinical hypnotherapy, hypnotic EMDR, hypnotic coaching, recovery coaching, NLP, which is neuro-linguistic programming, healing touch, Reiki, and conscious relationship coaching, along with extensive immersion in the world's spiritual traditions to facilitate the emergence and actualization of the authentic, essential self in the lives of those he works with. One of his greatest gifts is his ability to compassionately empathize with struggling couples and individuals and help them shift into epic clarity and skillfulness in their relationships. So Jason, thank you and welcome.
Thank you very much, Joe. Nice to be here.
So Jason, the first question I want to ask you is, what got you into this type of work?
Wow. Yeah. Okay. Good question. You know, it's kind of hard to put that into a tight nutshell, but the shortest thing I could come up with would be to say that I used to really, really struggle in lots of ways in life. Not just in relationships, definitely in relationships, but I also struggled with things like alcoholism and anxiety and depression. And, you know, I had a hard time holding jobs and functioning in life in a general sense. And so I was married and then divorced after 11 years of being in relationship with my then wife. And that was a huge wake-up call for me. That was back in 2006 or something like that. And that set me on a path, like kind of forced me to realize like I had some real growth to do, and I needed to really figure myself out because the patterns that I had been developing weren't working anymore. So I checked into therapy, and I had a sort of rock bottom experience at one point where I got so depressed, I actually like tore a ligament or blew out the meniscus in my right knee. And I couldn't walk for over a month, like from the injury to the recovery time from the surgery. I literally was unable to walk for a month. And I was living in a situation where I didn't have a lot of time with friends. And so I went into this deep depression, and I became almost suicidal. Like I wasn't actually planning anything, but I was like, I don't even know why I'm here anymore. I'm probably going to check out. I didn't actually plan it, but I came that close to planning it. And it was doing that giving up, that experience of giving up, that caused me to really just surrender to all of the pain that I had been holding in for a really long time. And when I did that, it kind of created this deep dive into my soul where I went through lots and lots of pain. I cried for days, just mourning all the loss and honestly, a lot of the repressed anger and shame that I had been stuffing over the years. And as all of that stuff came out, it just kept coming and coming and coming and coming. But after a while, it actually stopped coming out. And underneath all of it, there was this feeling of something that I hadn't felt since I was a kid. It was just this feeling of who I am. And I like to use the word essential self or authentic self. My core self came out of that process, and I connected with that version of me, that whatever it is underneath who I really am. And that thing that I connected with, that essential part of myself, said, it's time for you to start helping people in some way. You've spent the first 30 some years of your life figuring out how to get things from people. Now you need to start learning how to serve. And of course, you know, I had to learn how to serve in a way that was balanced. You know, I couldn't just serve to the extent that it completely wiped me out. That's another story for later on. But I checked into training. I decided to become trained as a hypnotherapist because a lot of what I had been doing within myself turned out to be self-hypnosis, and I just didn't know it. I was basically rewriting my memories from the past as I emerged from this, you know, this rock bottom experience. And I got into hypnotherapy, did that for quite a while. And then because I had overcome alcohol addiction and cigarette addiction, I decided to become a little more focused instead of just being the general hypnotherapist who helps with all kinds of stuff. I got more specifically focused on helping people to rebuild healthy lifestyles after they had given up a substance addiction, because that's usually the biggest challenge for people who, you know, who get sober. They're like, okay, well, I stopped doing the thing, now what? And that's a whole long process of like rebuilding your not just your patterns, not just your lifestyle patterns, but actually your identity and your personality. So I was focusing on that for quite a while. And it was after that, probably about 4 years of that, you know, and in the background, I'm still having, this whole time, I'm still having my own life experience, still learning from my own experience. And one of the themes that kept showing up over and over for me was that the hardest thing for me was to maintain a sense of well-being in a relationship. And I kept, you know, attracting relationships that basically ended up falling apart for various reasons. And I couldn't figure out why until like 2 relationships happened in a row. And I just learned a few really key things. And simultaneously, like right as that was happening, I was also experiencing working with clients who were having relationship troubles. And over the course of a few months, several key things all just snapped into place. And I realized, oh my goodness, I'm actually supposed to be helping people with their relationships. And that's when Daring Heart was born. And, you know, so all of that experience of my own personal struggle, big transformations in my own life on multiple levels, helping people with, you know, creating new patterns, a new sense of self, you know, a lot of really deep work, plus my own, you know, challenges in relationship all came together. And now I have like this really coherent, I think it's comprehensive and coherent map for what it is that people really need to understand about themselves, you know, in order to transform the results and the experience that they're having in their relationships.
That's great. Do you have a stated mission that you go by?
Yes, I do. Let's see if I can capture that. You know, and I say it differently at different times depending on the context, but basically my mission is to create a world where it's normal for people to connect and thrive in their relationships instead of being held down in disconnection and friction in the old relationship paradigm.
You know, what kind of issues are you seeing today with the clients during this pandemic?
That's a really good question. And I think a lot of people would probably be able to guess this. And if you have guessed this, you're right. Because of the tighter quarters that most of us are finding ourselves in, probably the most common theme that I'm seeing is that the tension that exists in people's relationships is being magnified. And, you know, we've got fewer options. There are fewer places to go. Most people are spending a lot more time together, whether they want to or not. And so whatever tension used to exist in the relationship is being magnified, and new forms of tension are being created. And so new problems are arising, and whatever the underlying challenges of the relationships were to begin with are rapidly coming to the surface. So tension and disconnection and whatever other challenges there might have already been.
Now, how have things been for you, you know, even on a personal level, you know, that you're going through, because you have a lot of tools and skill sets that you're able to use for your clients and also for yourself and in your relationship? Like, how are you dealing with it on a personal level?
Yeah. Yeah. I'm definitely included in that group of people, where I've found that due to who I am and what my personality is like, and going deeper, what my needs are as far as time and space and autonomy and things like that, I've been very deeply challenged, not having many options, places to go, things to do, spending a lot more time at home with my partner and our son, both of whom I love very much. And at the same time, I mean, in addition to like a lot of quality time that we've been having, our challenges have been coming up. And part of that for me has definitely been um, centered around the need to take space, not just like as a way of coping with difficulty, but as a way of centering myself and staying resourced myself and basically cultivating my own happiness. And there have been a lot of ways in which I used to just rely on schedule and circumstances to create that for me, but I can't do that anymore. And so I have to be a lot more proactive about recognizing, okay, I'm going to be needing a certain amount of time to do a certain number of things, time to work, time to center and decompress, and even time to create and things like that. So knowing that that's a need for myself, and then artfully communicating those needs, skillfully at least, to my partner in a way that recognizes her part of the experience and gives us an opportunity to arrive at agreements that actually work for both of us, has been an absolutely priceless skill set to have.
Well, I mean, I know the work that you've done for me in my personal life, I mean, greatly enhanced the issues that I was going through, relationship wise. And I'm in a much better place having done so. But what have you seen in terms of like the issues that you were helping people with before, and how has that been exacerbated now with people staying at home so much and having to be with each other like all the time now?
Yeah. I think one of the most noteworthy themes that I've seen that it did pre-exist, but it's being exasperated as of late, is what we would probably quite accurately call attachment dynamics. So if you're familiar with that, there's a spectrum of what we would call an attachment style. There's a spectrum of attachment styles that were formed early on in our development, depending on how we as infants in our vulnerability experienced the presence and care of our parents or caregiver, whatever our experience might have been. And we have different experiences and different responses to those experiences. And as a result, our personalities form differently. And we have a very definite tendency to be attracted to people and find ourselves in relationships with people who basically have the opposite type of attachment style. And I'm not saying that's everybody, but it's a common trend, it's a theme. And so I've been seeing a lot of that arising in the couples that I've been helping, where it has always been a topic. It's always been something very like central and important for people to understand and get to know about themselves and their partner so that they can navigate their compatibility dynamics. And with all of those combinations, though, the different types of attachment styles in relation to one another, there's different sets of challenges. And due to the circumstances that we're all finding ourselves in lately, those underlying challenges are being magnified, just like what I was saying earlier. So, for example, most recently, one of my clients was a couple, and they've been dealing with a lot of sudden change. They recently moved in together because of the situation. It made the most sense logically for them to move in together and cohabit. And as a result, they're suddenly now like trying to learn very rapidly how to work with one another, how to live with one another. And they're finding out that they're kind of becoming polarized. Like one of them is like having a tendency to like basically withdraw and make space almost all the time. And the other one is getting more clingy, so to speak, and needing more connection, and not knowing how to deal with the seeming separation that's happening. It's like they got closer, but now they're feeling like they're having to move apart because of what's arising within them. And that's definitely one of the common themes.
Well, that brings me to another question that I have is, I mean, how do you help people establish boundaries during this time? You know?
Yeah, that's it's a big, important question. Yeah. And it's a long exploration for every individual, it seems, where really it's a long process of recognizing that we actually have more choice and therefore more responsibility for understanding what we need, what we desire, what we value in our lives and in our relationships, and getting very familiar with those things, often through the trials and tribulation of relationships. And upon getting new awareness of our values, our needs, and our desires, it's up to us then to begin to take responsibility for them, and just as importantly, learn how to communicate those with our partner. So in addition to becoming aware of what we need and what boundaries we need to create, really the hard part for a lot of people is just in the communication of it, because it's often very difficult to be the other person who's on the other end of that situation when, let's say, your partner comes to you and says, hey, I have a need that I have not been able to meet yet, and I'm noticing that it's causing this tension in our relationship. And maybe their need is more space, maybe their need is more connection, more quality time, maybe it's more physical touch, you know, acts of service, if you want to go through the love languages, whatever their need or their desire or their value is. It can be difficult to be the person who's hearing that, and to hear it in a way that doesn't sound like they're saying you're not good enough, or there's a problem with you, or there's a problem with our relationship. And so that's where the communication comes in. We have to be able to learn new language for the most part, because we're not brought up in a culture that tends to provide us with the sort of language that actually makes that process functional. In fact, the culture that we are brought up in tends to have the opposite effect. It tends to actually create language patterns that are basically conflict based. And so when we have a need and we go to express that need to our partner, basically there's countless layers of processing that have us speak in such a way that often our partner isn't able to hear it, and that situation becomes a point of conflict, a point of tension. So actually having a need and communicating it where it has the potential to create connection and result in one person feeling more aligned and happy within themselves, therefore more able to show up to a healthy relationship. Instead of having that happen, it tends to create problems.
Now, regarding the 5 love languages, I mean, is that something that you use, and how do you apply that to help empower each individual?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do. I am a fan of the love languages as a good starting point for a lot of people. For one, a lot of people are actually familiar with it. I believe the creator, the author's name is Gary Chapman, and he wrote a book called The 5 Love Languages, where he describes that, again, due to our development, our history, and our personalities, we have different ways of understanding love and different ways of experiencing love. We have different ways of giving it and receiving it to our partners. And for those listening who may not be familiar with it, let me make sure I can recall what they are. Words of affirmation, meaning like, you know, positively, verbally reinforcing the value of your partner. Physical touch, hugging, cuddling, sex, all of that good stuff. Quality time, you know, time spent engaged in an intimate way where you're enjoying one another's company in some way. Acts of service, meaning like helping with keeping the house going, you know, doing things that contribute to the goals of your partner and show your support for what they're trying to accomplish. And the last one, and probably the least ubiquitous, the least common one, is gifts. A lot of folks like to use gift giving as a very touching way of communicating love to one another. So a lot of folks are able to very quickly understand that if they're not already familiar with it, it's pretty easy to explain that and have people understand it and see how it relates to them pretty rapidly. And that gives us a starting point for looking at, in a broad sense, looking at where the points of tension are. Because almost every couple, and certainly the ones that are seeking help and learning to grow or looking to grow through their process, can identify how one partner's love language doesn't perfectly match the other partner's love language. And so the differences create tension. And so we can use that as a starting point for understanding, okay, what are the underlying needs and the values and the desires, if we were to really unpack what that all means and what it looks like for everybody. So yeah, I find it very useful.
Well, regarding tension, how can people engage in conversation to work through all of those issues so it doesn't arise and get under people's skins and just blow up?
Right, exactly. I would like to start by saying that I think that anybody who is challenged by that should be aware that they are not alone, that it's basically the most common experience for most people in relationships, that the communication part is really difficult. You know, if you go into any bookstore and look in the relationship advice self-help section, you're going to find books on you're going to find books on communication. I'm sorry, will you refresh my memory? What was the exact nature of the question again?
It was, how can people engage in conversation to work through the tension so it doesn't boil up and explode?
Awesome, thank you. So how can people engage? That's the key part that I was losing track of. So people are not alone in that. And we have to acknowledge that, like I was saying earlier, we were brought up in a culture that does not encourage healthy communication. So I think that that's really important for people to understand, because a lot of folks have shame about it. I've been there, you know, I have certainly struggled quite a bit over the years, learning how to communicate. And I felt shame about that. Like, I'm a smart person. I'm a loving person. I'm caring. I enjoy being in a relationship. And yet here I am with this other smart, loving, capable person who enjoys being in a relationship, and our communication is so tense. And that's partly, and at the very least, it's in no small part due to the culture that we've come up in. So how to engage in healthy conversations, conversations that empower us as individuals, conversations that create connection between us, and conversations that even heal our old wounds, and thereby create out of a relationship something that's actually healing and empowering and even evolutionary for each person. How to do that involves unlearning the old patterns of communication and relearning new ones. And so we have to be able to look very closely at what aspects of the old communication paradigm are actually causing problems, and how do we replace them with healthy communication habits that eliminate those problems. And so a lot of people have probably at least heard of nonviolent communication, or NVC for short. And that really has been a game changer, culturally and for individuals and relationships, because what it has done, it has given us a new consciousness. It's given us a new consciousness around what's actually happening when we're communicating with each other. And it breaks that consciousness down into some basic principles that are actually very accessible and easy to understand. And as long as we can wrap our head around those basic principles and start to get a sense of how to use them with specific sequences of words, how to actually put together sentences and what to say and how to say it, we can replace the old paradigm, the old toxic ways of communicating, with a new set of language that supports a new consciousness around communication.
Now, I know that you created a kit called the Evolutionary Conversation Starter Kit. Now, is that process that you're talking about, is that included in that kit?
It is, yes. And the conversation part is very important, but it's also really important to understand that when we're talking about evolutionary conversations or conversations that connect and heal and empower, it really actually comes down to some degree of self-mastery. So if we get into the process of unpacking the challenges we're having in our relationships and learning new communication skills to facilitate greater connection, synergy in our relationships, ultimately what we're going to come up against is, for some of us, it certainly was for me, a long list of growth opportunities, you know, a long list of opportunities of, and I don't want to inflate that too much. For some people, it's a shorter list, but growth opportunities where we can cultivate a new relationship with our own thoughts. And a lot of people don't really question that, but I'm sure a lot of your audience has already, you know, developed awareness around mindfulness and, you know, becoming the observer and the witness, and perhaps even doing like cognitive behavioral processes where you question your thoughts and you consider alternative thoughts that you might think instead, and things like that, as well as new emotional habits that we can cultivate. So those growth opportunities that we encounter can often come down to mental mastery and emotional mastery. And the Evolutionary Conversation Starter Kit is a collection of tools. It's a video training series. It's an ebook. It's several downloadable audios and a couple of like graphic PDFs. And what it does is it introduces somebody to the main players, the main elements in this new consciousness of not just nonviolent communication, but like I was saying, mental and emotional mastery, which all work together in order to help us create really powerful shifts on the inside with our thoughts, our feelings, and the way we relate to one another. And that's why I called it the Evolutionary Conversation Starter Kit, because these tools all combine in a way that absolutely help people create greater connection and synergy in their relationships. But look, surprise, as a big bonus, we also become better people. We become stronger, more resourceful, more flexible in our whole reality. So that's what that's all about.
And going back on the topic of what we're talking about here, mental and emotional mastery, what do you recommend people do to improve themselves on a continual basis? I mean, is it just learning something once and then that's it? Or is it just this ongoing re-education of yourself to continue to grow and be in a state of a growth mindset?
I really like that question, yeah. And my best answer to that, based on my own experience personally and what I've seen in all my clients, is that it's a combination of both. I think some people get a little bit too registered in the idea that they're going to make a few quick fixes and that's going to solve their problems and they're not going to struggle anymore. And other people get a little bit too registered in the mindset that everything always has to be about growth and there's no space in life to just relax and be who we are and just kind of go with the flow. I think it's a combination of those two, where I think a healthy balance involves recognizing that there are some shifts that we only have to make once. There have been shifts that I only really had to make once in my life, you know, where it was like, oh, there's a before and an after to that one. There was my life before that shift, and then there's my life after it, and it was just, things have never been the same. And then there have been shifts, areas of work, areas of growth for me, and I definitely know I speak for a lot of other people, that tend to repeat. You know, themes tend to repeat in our lives. We tend to re-experience different, certain themes in different contexts and in different ways. And a lot of people get discouraged by that because it's easy to feel like, hey, I did some work. Wow, I'm not struggling with that anymore. a few months go by or a few years go by, and oh my gosh, boom, here's that problem again. I thought I did that work. I feel bad about myself now because I'm struggling with this thing that I thought I had overcome. But with a little bit of perspective, we can step back and look at it and realize, actually, okay, I get it. This is a theme. This is something that goes really deep. It goes way back. And I did accomplish a lot. I have accomplished a lot with this. And it just looks like this is one of those themes in my life that's going to repeat because it goes deep, and it's an opportunity for creating some kind of a center point around my personal growth. And that's what I've done for myself, and that's what a lot of my clients have done for themselves too. To really answer your question, I would like to suggest that recognizing every challenge that we experience, let's just look at it that way. We don't have to be terribly proactive. We don't have to look for things to fix. We don't have to, become super obsessed about fixing every aspect of our life. Life has a way of creating challenges often enough for most of us. And so developing what we would call quite aptly a growth mindset is really the key shift. It's one of those shifts that once you make it, like there's the before and the after, and they're very incomparable. But making the shift into a greater growth mindset means that we learn to look at all of our challenges not as inconveniences and not as an indication that there's something wrong with us or something wrong with our partner or something wrong with our relationship. A growth mindset would actually encourage us to approach all of the difficulties that we experience as exactly that, an opportunity for growth. So with that one shift, we don't have to be too obsessed with making the permanent fixes, and we don't have to be too obsessed with, proactively seeking the next self-help accomplishment. Because if we're just responding to the challenges that life gives us with equal measure to the challenge itself, we will grow through the process. And that's the beauty of what I would call an evolutionary partnership. Like, to me, that's what it's all about. That's why I call it an evolutionary conversation. And that's why I approach relationships the way that I do, and how I help my clients approach and transform their relationships as well. A growth mindset, learning how to utilize communication and self-mastery as a way of responding to the challenges of life and therefore growing.
That's great. I mean, how important do you feel it is to keep the balance and the harmony in a relationship? And also for maybe some people who are overthink too much in a relationship, or get overly emotional and allow those two parts of themselves to overtake them.
Yeah.
How do you help people with that?
Yeah. So let me make sure I understood the question there. I heard two parts. So the first part was, how important is it to maintain harmony and balance in a relationship? And also I heard, what should we do if we find ourselves as someone who becomes overly mental in our processes, or if we become someone who becomes subject to the whims of our emotions, perhaps a little too much? Wow, that's a really big question. And I think my most important answer to that question would be that it is up to all of us as individuals. It is up to us as individuals to decide how much disconnection, how much tension, and if we want to go into the dialogue of dysfunction and even into the realm of abuse, which is something in and of itself and another conversation, it's up to us as individuals to decide for ourselves where we are in terms of what's acceptable for us. And that's actually a growth edge for a lot of people, being able to recognize and be honest with ourselves about whether the relationship that we're in is, potentially like never actually going to become fluid and synergistic. It might always be a drain. that's for nobody to decide but the people in the relationship, really, unless of course we venture into the realm of abuse. If abuse is happening, you know, that needs to be dealt with immediately. And I never recommend somebody stays in an abusive relationship. But then again, there are like gray areas as far as what actually constitutes abuse. And that's where self-ownership, that's where sovereignty, you know, comes in. Sovereignty as a principle. I tend to speak of 4 core principles to evolutionary partnerships: sovereignty, empathy, sacred containers, and skillful means. And the sovereignty piece is huge in this question that you're asking. And it's something that I've had different attitudes about in my life. Where I'm at with it now, I'm in the most rewarding relationship I've ever been in my life. It's the most functional relationship I've ever been in. It's the most highly conscious relationship. Our communication is almost always really exquisite and you know, healing and connective, except for the times when it's not, when we struggle and, you know, my old stuff comes up. And the reality is, because of the challenges, there's like contextual reasons for the challenge that we're in right now, like the lockdown and, you know, the quarantine and all of this, putting us in this situation. And then there's also our internal dynamics, the things that we're having to come to terms with as individuals. Me in the past, 10 years ago, in this situation, I would have decided that this was too much. I would have decided that the challenges that I'm facing are too difficult. There's not enough harmony, too much tension going on. And I would have probably done my thing and left the relationship thinking that it was the relationship's problem or her fault or something like that. But now I have too much awareness. And if I'm going to be honest with myself, I have to look at the things that are actually causing tension in the relationship and that lack of harmony that you're talking about. And I have to be honest, wow, actually a lot of it is because I'm in a deep growth process. I'm at my next level, my highest level of growth to date. And if I were to walk away at this point, I would never be able to respect myself looking back. And so this brings me around to like the bottom line, like what this boils down to answer the question of how important is harmony. Like I said earlier, it boils down to the individual's need to decide that for themselves. And part of that decision-making process, in my view, really boils down to, have you really taken responsibility for all of your growth opportunities? If you've taken responsibility for all of your growth opportunities and you're actively working on them, and the relationship still continues to show no signs of hope for improvement or relief or greater harmony at some point, then that might be a good time to start asking the question, is this a healthy relationship for me? But most people, you know, give or take, can't honestly say that. They can't honestly say that they've actually really taken responsibility for all of their growth opportunities. So that would be my challenge to them. And again, I want to look at the other side too, just briefly before I move on to the second part of your question. Sometimes the growth opportunity is giving ourselves permission to walk away from something that we just absolutely know is not going to be good for us, no matter how much work we do in ourselves or in the relationship. And the growth opportunity is like taking care of yourself by removing yourself from that situation. So there's that side as well. So that's the first, that was the first answer to the first part of your question. And then you asked about the tendency to either get too much in our head or the tendency to become too emotional. And obviously there's like a great deal of, there's a big spectrum there. And there's a lot of like, there's the extreme, you know, and I'm sure we if we're not that way ourselves, we all know somebody at either extreme or, you know, in places in the middle. And some people have the ability to actually get in either extreme in the same day, you know, like, and I actually find myself in that place sometimes. Some days I can get really caught up in my head and really overly identified with my thought process. And then I can shift a bit over the course of a day and find that I'm just having all the feels today. And, you know, my thoughts are no longer really that important to me. It's just all about what I'm feeling, and I want to listen to music, and I want to like move my body. And, you know, we could call that masculine and feminine tendencies if we wanted, if that was useful for us. We could generalize and say, yeah, there's definitely a tendency there in the world where men tend to go a little bit more towards the mental side and women tend to go more towards the emotional side, although that's not always true. But the question of what do we do about that, I think would be to, first of all, admit to ourselves that there is such a thing. Like, obviously your question shows that you're aware of it. And to admit to ourselves that, okay, maybe I do have this thing where I get too wrapped up in my head sometimes. Or if you're somebody who gets too wrapped up in your emotions sometimes, just recognizing that, you know, and admitting it to ourselves can be a huge shift. You know, just getting over that point of admitting it to ourselves is often groundbreaking for people. And it certainly was for me, you know, when I had to go through that process. The next step would be deciding for ourselves what would be more desirable, not based on what society tells us, you know, or our family or anybody out there in the world says, because we'll get different ideas and they may not be the best ideas. They may not be aligned, with who we really are. But to choose for ourselves, like, who would I really like to be? What would be the best version of me that I think is possible right now? And would that version of me have more of an ability to catch myself when I'm looping in my thoughts? Probably. Okay, cool. Would that healthy version of me have some more options for myself, like the ability to stop my looping thought processes and shift gears, find a way to focus on something else and create new neural pathways that allow for a different experience for myself? I think I could probably do that. Cool. You know, basically it's about setting goals for yourself, about how you want to show up in the world. I don't have any ideas about who you should be or who any client should be, or even, and I'm learning still to this day how to let go of who I think my partner should be, you know, because rather than answering the question of, am I to this or am I not enough that, from the world's point of view, we are actually missing a big opportunity if we don't look inside. If we don't look inside and ask ourselves, what is the most authentic version of me? Like, what is it like if I were to get to the deepest part of myself, like, and if you like the word soul, I do, what is my soul blueprint? You know, who am I at the level of my soul? And how well does my pattern, how well does the way that I show up in the world reflect that essential self, who I really am underneath all of it? And so when I'm able to compare those two things, that gives me a map of where I am and where I'd like to be. And that clarifies, it gives me a goal to set, and that clarifies where some of my opportunities are. So approaching it with a growth mindset and getting in touch with our authentic self and taking baby steps, not expecting the whole thing to happen over the course of a few months, just engaging the process as, you know, part of what we're doing as we express ourselves as human beings on the path of becoming whatever we are.
Well, and you said something earlier in that regarding blame and not taking responsibility in the relationship. And if this was 10 years ago, you would have just checked out and left.
Yeah.
Can you talk about the difference between when someone approaches a relationship in a way of what can I get from this versus what can I give in this?
Yeah, that's a really juicy one. Let's see. So what can I get versus what can I give? I think that I usually almost always like to take an inclusive approach to the personality, the psyche. There are many layers and elements to what our personalities and our beings consist of. And I find that asking ourselves, what can I get, often comes from an early stage of development that we naturally go through. You know, you look at a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old or most 5-year-olds, and I'm not really that clear about the stages of childhood development, but you get the rough idea. They're pretty much generally concerned with what can they get, right? You know, what's in it for me? Oh, do I get to eat this? Do I get to play with that? You know, it's a natural stage of development. However, that can become kind of solidified, and it can become too well developed in a person's personality for them to be able to combine in an effective, healthy, interdependent way in a romantic partnership. And the next stage of development, even if we're just looking at childhood development, actually does move along to, okay, how can I be of service? How can I help? How can I give? And that's a whole wave of psychological development that we have to go through. And I think a lot of people also can quite often get stuck in that stage of development as well, where they overemphasize giving and giving and giving and giving to the point of exhaustion and self-abandonment, and leaving themselves in the dust in the process of trying to get their needs met by giving to somebody, hoping that they get back from that person what it is that they crave at their core. And that doesn't really work so well either. But what we find is that, and what I think I see, what I believe is that the next stage of development has to do with growing beyond even that stage and looking back and seeing the validity of both of them. And we can call this, I look at it through the 4 stages of consciousness, and I think that's probably another conversation for another time, but we could say, just to really make it basic, that stage 1 is about dependence. It's about depending on things that we need coming from the outside world, and being at the whim of life and the people around us. Stage 2 is more about independence and control, and you know, life happens by my will, that kind of thinking. Stage 3 is about interdependence. So we go from dependence to independence, and a lot of people get stuck in either of those two, but to move further along is to move into healthy interdependence. And that's not to exclude. Healthy interdependence does not say, I should not ask what's in it for me. Healthy interdependence does not mean that I don't have self-interest. It doesn't mean that I don't care what I get out of a situation. It includes that, but it also includes, okay, what does the other person in the situation desire, need, value, and how can I provide that for them? And to do so from a place that's beyond the idea or the unconscious feeling of there being an agreement or some kind of transaction. So we have to be able to include those parts of ourselves and include those parts of the other person in a way that doesn't set up the idea that if I give something to you, you're going to give something back to me, and therefore we're going to both have our needs met. It expands the equation into something much more elaborate, where rather than an exchange of getting our needs met, healthy interdependence becomes more about how can we support one another in that unfolding of our authentic selves? How can I support her in becoming who she really is? And she's asking herself the same questions. How can she support me in becoming who I really am? And we're both asking ourselves, how can I become who I really am? How can we become our best selves as individuals? And how can we become our best selves mutually, supporting each other in that way?
Now, and then that leads to my next question. I mean, which is, how do you help people create connection and this synergy versus the disconnection that a lot of times arises in relationships?
Yeah, because it really does. And disconnection happens to all of us. Absolutely. I think I'm going to pull together, my answer will pull together a few pieces from what I've already said. First of all, it has to do with having a growth mindset. because disconnection is going to happen. But if we have a growth mindset, then we're going to recognize that the disconnection is happening because there are growth opportunities in the mix. And so that brings in the next 4 principles, which again, I mentioned earlier, the 4 core principles of evolutionary partnerships. They're the same as the 4 core principles of evolutionary conversations, which are sovereignty, empathy, sacred containers, and skillful means. If I can recognize that I'm in a growth opportunity because there's disconnection, then I can check in with the principles of sovereignty and empathy, for starters, which would be to ask myself questions about what am I actually responsible for within myself. Sovereignty is all about, recognizing that I have my own experience. My experience is my experience. Nobody can actually force me to think or feel or do anything. We all affect each other, but I'm the one who's responsible for my thoughts. I'm the one who's responsible for my emotions, and I'm the one who's responsible for what I say and do. And that's sovereignty, and the ability to wield my conscious choice, my will, in accordance with that awareness. That's sovereignty. And that's often the first step for a lot of people, taking self-ownership in that way. Empathy. But if you have sovereignty without empathy, you might have a problem, because empathy is the next step where we realize, okay, I'm sovereign. Nobody can make me feel a certain way. So is my partner. My partner is also a sovereign being. I'm not responsible for her feelings in a direct sense. However, as a conscious partner who is engaged in that mutual process of supporting each other to become our best selves, it's partly my responsibility. It's our mutual responsibility to recognize the validity of one another's experience. So my experience is mine to take responsibility for. That's sovereignty. Empathy is recognizing that her experience is equally as important. His or her, whoever our partner is, our partner's experience, their internal reality is equally important, and this is often very difficult, equally valid. Whatever they're thinking, whatever they're feeling is completely valid. A lot of the time, disconnection happens because we think that our perspective and our experience is correct and valid and important, but our partners somehow, in some way, whether it's obvious or not, is invalid and unimportant. So empathy, the switch into empathy, which again, a lot of us are not culturally conditioned into, means having compassion for the other person's experience without commiserating. The ability to say, okay, whatever you're experiencing internally is valid and real, just like whatever I'm experiencing internally is valid and real. But neither of our subjective experiences actually represent the big picture objective truth. They never can and they never will. And if we can recognize both of those things, we can, in a collaborative way, we can recognize that there's not just a growth opportunity that is causing the disconnection, but it is actually a connection opportunity, a breakthrough opportunity. When we get to that place, man, it's really magical what starts to happen when we realize something bigger than us is happening through us. That's returning back to the healthy interdependence thing. When we realize that something bigger is happening through us, we have whatever language we want for that, God, spirit, source, or just life happening through these two human beings. And we anchor ourselves in sovereignty, self-responsibility, and empathy, acceptance, embrace, and compassion for the other person's experience, and then allowance for both of those to be true. All kinds of weird ego stuff is able to be released, and we can make room for healing experiences where we can actually recognize that the reason we're upset about the other person is often because there's an old wound underneath that we haven't healed yet. Something that happened in our past, whether it was through our upbringing or through an early lover or whatever it may have been, it's valid because it's what we're feeling when it comes up, and we're triggered and we're mad, we're scared, we're frustrated, whatever. That's, again, not just a growth opportunity, not just a connection opportunity. It's also a breakthrough opportunity, because it's an opportunity to come into contact with that old unresolved stuff that we all have somewhere underneath, and to let it out in a healthy and responsible way that doesn't hurt other people, and give it voice and consciousness so that we can actually reintegrate that old hurt part of ourselves in a way that actually serves us in a conscious way.
Well, I want to go back to what you said earlier about authenticity.
Yeah.
How do you help people maintain their authenticity in a relationship?
Mm-hmm. I love that question. So at this point, if we're talking about authenticity, like if I'm coaching somebody and we're talking about authenticity and I'm helping them to maintain their authenticity, or even expand it and like really, really deeply embody it, we've already established a growth mindset. We've already established those core principles of sovereignty and empathy. We've established the ideas of healthy interdependence, stage 3 conduit consciousness, the awareness that something bigger is always happening through everybody. And ultimately the acceptance of, at the very least as an useful idea, the soul blueprint, or the authentic self, the essential self even. If we've established those ideas, then the process of encouraging the deeper embodiment of the essential self, of authentic expression of who we really are, very much like what we were talking about earlier, is something that presents itself. It's when we experience tension. It's when we experience unmet needs. It's when we experience that we don't like something that's happening. If we're anchored in sovereignty, one of our first questions will be, okay, how am I contributing to this? What can I rightfully take responsibility for about myself that is resulting in this external experience that's unsatisfying to me? And almost always there's some kind of an unexpressed desire, value, or need. An unexpressed desire, an unexpressed value, or an unexpressed need is what inauthenticity is made of. And authenticity, therefore, is about expressing and skillfully expressing our actual desires, our actual values, and our actual needs in a way that honors the other, empathy, and provides a way for us to create agreements in our relationships that allow for us to be more of who we really are.
But now, if a couple are at the point in their relationship where they're constantly bickering, fighting, arguing, what would you recommend? How would you help them to transform that conflict back into connection?
Yeah, you've got some good questions today, Joe. So how would I help them if they're constantly bickering and fighting? So if they have come to me, if we've booked a session and or a series of sessions or whatever, that couple has already shown me in some way, shape, or form that they've got a growth mindset. I don't work with people who they want their partner to change, because their partner is the one with all the problems. And I don't work with people who think that I have the ability to like wave a magic wand, even if it's like an unconscious belief that I have a magic wand and I can, somehow transform their relationships for them. People who come and work with me are people who are able to say, okay, gosh, we're like we're bickering, we're fighting, there's so much tension, and we're not sure why, but we love each other very much, and we're both committed to the relationship, and we're just confused. We're just grasping at straws. We don't know what to do. At that point, I have them watch this interview because then they'll get a lot of good answers. But quite seriously, we'll talk about a lot of these same things, but we'll do so. I don't like to be the teacher. I don't like to be the authority who knows all the things. I like to be a collaborator. I like to connect with people, connect with them as individuals and connect with them as a couple. And by the way, I don't want the word to get too far out there, but my partner and I have been doing couples work with other couples. So she and I will do Zoom sessions with other couples. Whatever the case is, I like to connect with them as individuals, connect with them as couples. And I have such a strong belief in this healthy interdependence and this idea of the conduit consciousness, this idea that some larger force is working through us, that I'm able to step back. I offer my insights, I offer my experience. I have teaching materials, I have training materials and processes, NLP processes and hypnotherapy processes and all that kind of good stuff. But what I really love doing and what I'm really good at is what I think is the center point of all of it, which is I collaborate with people and I help them to tap into their own genius, tap into their own wisdom. I help them tap into themselves. And when I'm able to do that, again, if they're in the right place, if they're ripe for it, which I only work with people who are, that unleashes a process. Like I almost never have to approach the sessions going, okay, so today we're going to A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Rather, I come to the session with something of an agenda, something of a structure, that helps us move through the process efficiently, and it gives us something to come back to if we need to at any point. But it's very rare that that's needed, because for whatever reason, that this is my gift, if there is such a thing, is to really invite that genius from people, to really elicit from them what they already know on some level. Often it's unconscious, about what they need to do next. And that's really it. I believe that all of us, we already know what we need to do next. And getting the right kind of help isn't about having somebody else tell us what we need to do next. It's about combining and collaborating energy with somebody so that we can connect with that part of ourselves that already knows what to do next.
And I know we talked a lot about couples in regards to what you do and how you coach people. Do your methods apply to children as well?
Yeah, surprisingly a lot, actually. And quite honestly, I was not aware of that until, the last couple of years, because I don't have any biological children of my own. And it's in this relationship that I've been in with Hannah for a couple of years now, where she has a son. And so now I have a son. And I have discovered that, I had a lot to learn about parenting. And wow, it's hard. Parenting is hard. And she's already done a lot of the hard stuff, raising an infant and a toddler and through those early stages. But even just a teenager presents, this set of challenges that's it really has been a wake-up call for me to become aware of things that I didn't know that I needed to work on, areas in which I realize now, gosh, I thought I had overcome that, but no, there's that thing again, being defensive, for example, taking things personally. I got pretty good at, rewiring myself and my responses to that in a romantic, intimate partnership. But for whatever reason, when the 13-year-old boy says something to me, it's so easy for me to take it personally, as if they're actually trying to show disrespect or something, but he's not. he's really not. He's a great kid. So I've had to, like, repeatedly on a daily basis go through these experiential processes where I go, wow, this is what I teach people about in romantic relationships, except it's with a younger human being. And wow, I kind of suck at this right now. I need to improve. And so, yes, all the same principles come into play again. It's a different set of desires, you know, it's a different set of values. I mean, not entirely. It's a unique set of desires, values, and needs. And the same principles as far as like sovereignty and empathy and the communication skills absolutely apply, you know, like the ability to like get out of my own head and realize, okay, he's having his own experience. And if I try to communicate to him something that's coming from this egoic position of I'm right and you're wrong, it's not going to land, you know, it's not going to have any effect. It's going to have a negative effect probably. So I need to check myself. I need to get in touch with what I'm thinking and feeling, take responsibility for my own stuff, and approach him in a way that honors him as a sovereign individual. I mean, yeah, I'm responsible for him. I set some of the rules that he lives by. I'm responsible for a certain degree of discipline and so on, but he's not anyone's possession. He's not, you know, he's a sovereign being. And it reminds me of all the times when I was a kid and somebody would talk down to me as if I was not a sovereign being. And I was like, yeah, man, I am no longer listening to you. I won't hear it from you. And I see that happen in him when I come from that place. So that's been a process. I have to apply the same principles with him. And nonviolent communication involves language patterns that when I remember, and I'm getting better and better all the time at remembering them, when I remember to use these, you know, these more effective language patterns, it's pretty magical. You know, he's more than receptive. He's more than willing, and he wants to do the right thing. And if I can step up my game as I have been, then we get along great and life is a lot better. So long story short, yes, it's very much the same.
So it sounds like, because for some people, they would think, oh, you know, kids they just want to check out. They don't want anything to do with the parent, and, you know, they're disrespectful. But from what you're saying, it's a matter of the approach of how you deal with them, of what you say to them, or how you react to what they're saying or behaving, right?
Yeah, I think you're right on. And, you know, there's other things to consider, like stages of development. You know, I think that we all go through stages where we really need to reject things. We really need to rebel in some way, just as a part of claiming our sense of self, you know, forming an identity, and that will come out, you know, and I don't think that that's entirely avoidable. But to answer your question, so much of the challenge and the difficulty that we experience in any interpersonal situation has to do with how we are relating to it, how we are approaching it, and what skills we have for that situation.
Well, we're nearing the end of our interview, but I wanted to ask you about this thing that you have, that's the 101 golden phrases. And
Yes,
can you talk about some of those phrases, why you created it, how it helps people?
absolutely. Yeah. So this is something that's free. It's available on my website, and uh, it's part of the Evolutionary Conversation Starter Kit that I was talking about earlier, which is the video training series and audio downloads and PDFs and whatnot. It's an ebook, and I think it's like 20 pages or something. It's not very long, and it's almost entirely this list of 101 phrases. The title is 101 Golden Phrases for Creating Conversations That Empower, Connect, and Heal. And it's actual sentences, it's actual phrases that you can use in your conversation, particularly with you know, a committed romantic partner. But if you wanted, you could apply it to so many other situations as well. And I made it because it was really common working with clients to get to a point where people were like, yeah, I'm really getting these principles. I'm understanding the growth mindset. I'm understanding healthy interdependence. I'm understanding attachment. I'm understanding the process of like integrating my wounds. And I'm even understanding, you know, like sovereignty and empathy, but sometimes I still just don't know what the heck I'm supposed to say. And, you know, we've all been there, and I still find myself there from time to time. It's a normal thing. Like understanding something consciously is one step in the process, but getting to the point where we actually embody the awareness of something so deeply that we don't have to think about what we're doing, that's a whole other step entirely, you know, unconscious competency. Well, the 101 phrases is designed to help people who are, you could be anywhere in the spectrum. You could be brand new to all of this, or you could be like at the point where you're really getting the ideas and you're just needing the right language at certain moments. But it's broken down into the sequences, the sequence that we might experience, you know, with give or take during an actual healthy conversation with somebody. You know, if we have a conversation that blows up in our face, like we all have, and creates more disconnection, you know, often you can like map out like the steps of what happened. One person said this, the other person said that. They took each other personally. Now they're talking about what they said to each other. Now they're fighting about how they're talking to each other. Now they're fighting about how they're fighting about how they're talking to each other. And it just goes like that. And next thing you know, you've got a problem. Similarly, an empowering and connective and healing conversation has a similar sequence to it. I mean, not a similar one. It has its own sequence to it. And that's how the document is laid out. It's laid out in such a way that a person could say, okay, babe, let's try this out. Let's have a conversation. Okay, we've been disagreeing about this thing. Let's go ahead and have a conversation. Let's use this format. And we're going to practice using some of the phrases that are in here. And in the first section, which is about creating a sacred container, it doesn't have to be sacred if you're not like super spiritual in your thinking. It's really just about setting the stage for, you know, setting yourselves up for success, basically, instead of setting yourselves up for suffering. And there's a bunch of sentences in that section, a bunch of phrases that you can say, like, gosh, I can't even remember. You know, I'm going to open it up real quick. Is that cool?
Sure. Yeah.
All right. Because I do have access to it right here. And I'd love to read the first one. So in the first section, in container setting, the first sentence is, I have a desire to blank. And then in parentheses, I've put, be understood, understand you, feel more connected, or to collaborate on a solution for something. Because those are basically the reasons that we want to have conversations with somebody. We want to feel understood, or to understand our partner, create understanding, or we want to create a feeling of connection with each other, or we just want to work something out. We want to collaborate on a solution for some kind of challenge that we're having. And to know that, and to say to your partner, I have a desire to be understood right now. Would you be willing to have a conversation about that? That's a very far cry from what a lot of us have tended to do in the past, where, you know, conversations erupt sideways outside of our intent because, you know, this happened and we reacted to it or whatever. And that's still always, you know, possible. But with this book, you can start to get an idea of how to approach a conversation proactively, you know, with intention. And the subsequent sections, I'll give you a whole bunch of different phrases that you can use for saying what comes next, you know, after the setting the container. Gosh, I can't remember off the top of my head. Story is often the next step, which has to do with recognizing the fact that, you know, if we're having a problem, if we're having a difficulty in our relationship, and we're fighting and we're arguing, we're upset for whatever reason, even if we haven't actually started the conversation yet, chances are, if I'm upset about something that my partner has done, it's because I have a story in my head about what they did and why they did it. It's as if I know what her intentions were. It's as if I know what she was thinking and what she was feeling. And bless my heart, I just naturally seem to know what she was thinking and feeling and why she did it. And I tell myself that story and I believe it until I catch myself and I go, okay, all right, I'm telling myself the story that she did X, Y, or Z because she doesn't respect me, or because she values something else more than she values me, or one of my stories that still comes up sometimes is I'm not good enough. Like, so the next section, the next part of a conversation after you've created the container often comes down to taking responsibility for the stories that you have, because it's really important to understand that just because you have that story doesn't mean it's actually what's true for the other person. And when you can really know that, and you can own that, when you can approach the person who you love and care about and say, I've been telling myself this story that you don't respect me because of this and that and the other thing, and I'd like for you to know how I've been feeling in response to this situation that happened. That's an example of how a person can set themselves up to be heard by the other person instead of setting themselves up to get a negative reaction from somebody. Like the old way of communicating, the old paradigm is, you did this and I'm pissed about it because you're this, that, or the other thing. You're wrong. My story says this and my judgment is that. The healthy, the more conscious way, the sovereign and empathic way is to say, okay, this thing happened. Here's my story about why it happened, which is what elicited these emotions in me. And here's all of the emotions that I take responsibility for in myself. And I'm just hoping that you'd be willing to reflect back to me what it is that you heard about my experience, because there's something magical that happens when we can say that and have the other person go, wow, yeah, I had no idea you were thinking that or feeling that. And gosh, if I was in your shoes, I probably would have felt that way too, especially if I had that story. Hearing those words is like healing balm on the soul, to have somebody actually say, I get it. Yeah, gosh, that sounds like that was really difficult for you. And it's not, and that's just a microcosm. That's just a small nugget of an example, but that's what this book helps you with. It gives you phrases for saying things like that, according to the core principles, according to sovereignty, according to empathy, according to containers, sacred containers, and according to skillful means, which is the more nuts and bolts of what to say. So that's what the book is about.
What's amazing to me, what you just shared, is that the one phrase out of those 101 phrases I got was vulnerability.
Yeah.
Because you're actually sharing with your partner exactly what is causing a disturbance in yourself.
Yes.
Which leads to authenticity as well. It leads them back to the authenticity. But I think with that, I think it's a good place to wrap up this interview. And please tell our viewers and our customers where they can find you, how they can book a session with you, how they can download the free ebook, and also your social media handles.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so all of that would be at my website, which is daringheart.com. It's spelled the way you might expect, D-A-R-I-N-G, heart, H-E-A-R-T, no spaces. And the website is pretty self-explanatory. The free download for the ebook will be on the front page there. And if you're interested in doing more work with me along these lines, you'll go to apply for an appointment or work with me, depending on which part of the site you're on. And then as far as social media, the only place I really do anything currently is on Facebook. I do have an Instagram account, which is Daring Heart Conscious Relationships on Instagram. And then Facebook is Jason Keene. I'm just Jason Keene on Facebook. If you do a search for Jason Keene and then probably conscious relationships, I'll probably come up in the search.
Well, thank you, Jason. Really appreciate you having you on here.
My pleasure, Joe. I really appreciate the chance to share these things with people, and I appreciate what you're doing too.
Well, thank you.